Part 1. The Forgotten Custodian. David had been sweeping the archive corridors for 17 years. Every morning, he woke up in his small quarters on the lower maintenance level, dressed in his gray uniform, and made his way through the same endless hallways. The janitor moved silently past towering aliens of magnificent forms. Verdants with glowing skin drifted past him without a glance. Architects made entirely of crystal walked by, their bodies refracting light into impossible colors. Ethereals floated through the air like ghosts, their translucent forms barely visible. None of them saw him. He was human. Forgettable. David had accepted this a long time ago. When he first arrived at the Intergalactic Heritage Archive, he had felt the weight of being unremarkable. While other species boasted incredible abilities and ancient histories, humans were known for one simple thing: they could work hard and follow orders. They could do the jobs that others did not want to do. They could fade into the background. The archive was the largest repository of knowledge in the known galaxy. It held records from thousands of civilizations, artifacts from extinct species, and information about the origins of the universe itself. Beings of tremendous intelligence and power worked here every day, studying the mysteries of existence. They conducted important research. They made groundbreaking discoveries. And they left messes everywhere. David swept those messes. He cleaned the floors, wiped down the walls, and organized the maintenance supplies. He worked the night shift mostly when the corridors were empty. This made his job easier in some ways. He did not have to navigate around important scientists or dodge exotic energy fields. But it also made his invisibility complete. By the time day shift arrived, all evidence of his work was gone, as if he had never been there at all. The archive had 17 main levels, each dedicated to a different era of galactic history. The upper levels held the most recent records and the most advanced technology. The lower levels contained older materials, many of which the current civilizations no longer understood. David had swept every corridor on every level. He knew the archive better than anyone, though no one thought to ask him what he knew. He had always wondered about the lowest level. The archive officially had 17 levels, but David knew there was a level below. Access was restricted. He had been told never to go there, and he had obeyed that instruction for 17 years. But sometimes, when he was working on level 17 late at night, he could feel something calling to him from below. It was a strange sensation, like a whisper he could not quite hear, like a door left slightly open. On this particular morning, something was different. David felt it the moment he stepped into the corridor. The air seemed to shimmer slightly. The walls appeared to glow with a faint light that had not been there before. His broom felt different in his hands too, as if it wanted to move in a certain direction, pull him toward something. Without fully understanding why, David made his way to the restricted area. The security door that should have been locked stood open. He descended a narrow staircase he had never seen before, his broom trailing behind him. The air grew colder as he went down. The light became dimmer. But something inside him knew he was supposed to be here. The lowest level looked nothing like the rest of the archive. It was not clean and organized. It was ancient and covered in dust. The walls were made of dark stone instead of the gleaming metal that covered the upper levels. Strange symbols were carved into every surface, symbols that seemed to glow with their own faint light. The ceiling stretched high above him, lost in shadow. David walked slowly through this forgotten space, his footsteps echoing. He felt like he had stepped back in time, to an age before the modern civilizations, before the current archive had been built. This place felt old. Older than anything he had ever encountered. That morning, as David swept his broom across the ancient floor, it struck something solid beneath the dust. He knelt down and carefully brushed away the accumulated grime of countless years. Beneath his hands, 7 stones appeared, arranged perfectly in a circle. Each stone was about the size of his hand, smooth and dark, with patterns that seemed to flow across their surfaces like water frozen in time. David knew he should stop. He knew he should leave this place and forget what he had seen. But something pulled him forward. The stones seemed to call to him, to recognize him somehow. With trembling fingers, he reached out and touched the first stone. The moment his hand made contact, everything changed. The 7 stones blazed with brilliant light, so bright that David had to close his eyes. The light filled the entire lowest level, pouring up through the staircase, spreading through every corridor of the archive. And then the alarms began. They screamed through every hallway, every room, every level. Louder and louder, until the entire building seemed to shake with sound. Something had awakened. Something that had been sleeping for a very, very long time. And David, the forgotten janitor, had just brought it back to life. Part 2, The Awakening. Scientists arrived within minutes of the alarm. They came running through the corridors in groups of 2 and 3, their eyes wide with confusion and concern. Some carried instruments that clicked and hummed. Others simply moved as fast as their alien bodies could carry them. They descended the stairs to the lowest level, following the fading light and the echo of the alarm that still rang through the ancient chamber. David stood in the center of the circle of stones, his hand still touching the first one. The light had dimmed now, but it had not gone away completely. The stones still glowed with a soft, steady radiance. When the scientists saw him, they stopped in their tracks. They looked at each other, uncertain. A human janitor standing in the most restricted level of the archive, surrounded by stones that no one had seen activated in recorded history. More aliens arrived. Higher-ranking officials. Beings of obvious importance and power. They wore clothing that shimmered with advanced technology. Some had bodies made of pure energy, contained only by force fields that hummed quietly. Others were larger than buildings, forced to compress themselves to fit inside the chamber. They all stared at David with expressions ranging from shock to anger to something that might have been awe. Then the Supreme Council arrived. These were the oldest and most powerful beings in the archive. An architect stepped forward, its body made entirely of crystal that refracted the glowing light into rainbow patterns. Its voice, when it spoke, sounded like wind chimes and the creaking of ancient wood combined. "The Founder Stones," the architect whispered as if speaking to itself. "Only a true heir can activate them. Only someone descended from the original architects of consciousness. But that is impossible. No such being exists in this age." The architect's eyes, which seemed to be made of liquid diamond, turned to look at David. Really look at him. For the first time in 17 years, David felt truly seen. Not as a janitor. Not as something to be ignored or dismissed. But as something that mattered. "What is your name?" the architect asked. "David," he said quietly. "I am just a janitor." "You were just a janitor," the architect corrected gently. "But you are more than that now. The stones have recognized you. They do not make mistakes." Before anyone could respond, David felt a sensation in his mind. It was not painful, but it was overwhelming. Images began to flood his thoughts. Visions of impossible scale and beauty. He saw vast civilizations spread across galaxies, beings of unimaginable power working together to create the foundation of consciousness itself. He saw the original architects, tall and luminous, walking through dimensions that normal eyes could not perceive. David watched as these ancient beings performed great works. They seeded planets with the potential for life. They guided young civilizations toward knowledge and understanding. They built structures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. They were creators, artists, philosophers all at once. They were gods to the species that came after them. But then something changed in the visions. David saw fear on the faces of the architects. He saw them gathering together, discussing something in urgent tones. They had discovered something in the depths of space. Something old. Something wrong. A presence that did not belong to their dimension, a consciousness that threatened everything they had built. The visions showed David the architects making a terrible decision. They could not destroy this thing. They could not fight it directly. So instead they chose to scatter. They fragmented their own people across the stars, hiding them among other species. They erased memories. They sealed their archives. They created the Founder Stones as a failsafe, a beacon that would activate only when a true heir returned to claim their birthright. And then they vanished, leaving their children lost in the galaxies, unaware of who they truly were. David gasped as the visions ended. He understood now. He understood everything. Humans had not come from some backwater planet, seeking work among the stars. Humans were descended from the original architects themselves. His species had not fallen from greatness. They had been deliberately hidden, scattered and diminished by their own ancestors to keep them safe from whatever dark thing lurked in the void. "What did you see?" asked a verdant scientist, its bioluminescent skin pulsing with curiosity. David found that he could barely explain it. But as he tried to speak, something new happened. He realized he could do things he had never been able to do before. He looked at the walls of the chamber, and suddenly he could see the energy patterns flowing through them. He could see how the stones connected to ancient systems that predated the modern archive by millions of years. He could see the mathematics underlying reality itself, written in threads of light and shadow that only he could perceive. The stones had unlocked something dormant within him. His human DNA, he realized, still carried the genetic memory of his ancestors. The Founder Stones had activated that memory, awakening abilities that humans had possessed long ago, abilities that had been sleeping for countless generations. David could perceive energy patterns that no other species could see. He could understand the mathematical language of reality. He could communicate with the ancient systems of the archive directly, speaking to them in a language that was somehow both foreign and perfectly familiar. The computers responded to him. The doors obeyed his thoughts. The protective barriers recognized him as their master. The Supreme Council watched in silence as David demonstrated these newfound abilities. They looked at each other, their expressions grave. Something fundamental had changed in the galaxy. A human janitor had become something far more significant. And no one, not even the Supreme Council, could predict what would happen next. Part 3. The Burden of Knowledge. David was elevated overnight from janitor to honored guest. The change happened so quickly that he barely had time to understand it. One day he was cleaning floors in the maintenance corridors, invisible and forgotten. The next day he was being escorted through halls he had never seen before, past security doors that opened automatically when he approached, into chambers of impossible architecture and ancient beauty. The scientists treated him differently now. They no longer ignored him or looked through him as if he did not exist. Instead, they watched him constantly, studying his every movement, recording his reactions. They spoke to him with respect, sometimes even with reverence. But David could feel something underneath their politeness. Suspicion. Uncertainty. Fear. They brought him to vast libraries filled with records from ages past. Ancient tablets made of materials that should not have been able to survive millions of years. Crystals that held information encoded in ways that modern technology could barely understand. They granted him access to forbidden archives, sections of the archive that had been sealed away because the knowledge they contained was considered too dangerous or too destabilizing for most civilizations. David walked through these chambers and the ancient systems recognized him. Displays activated at his approach. Doors unlocked. Holographic projections filled the air with visions from billions of years in the past. He could access information that the greatest scientists in the galaxy had spent their entire lives trying to decode. With just a thought, he could communicate with computers that had been silent for millions of years. The knowledge flowed into his mind like water, and he absorbed it effortlessly, as if he had always known it on some deep level. But as his knowledge grew, so did the resistance. Other species began to whisper in the corridors and in the research chambers. The whispers were quiet at first, but they grew louder with each passing day. A verdant scientist approached David in one of the libraries. Her bioluminescent skin flickered with agitation as she spoke. If humans were truly the ancient architects, the builders of our civilization, then why are you so weak? She asked bluntly. Why do you possess only one body, one mind? Why can you not split your consciousness across multiple dimensions like we can? Why do you need to breathe air and consume food? The architects were supposed to be gods. David did not have a good answer for her. He tried to explain that his species had been deliberately diminished, that the knowledge of their true nature had been erased. But the verdant was not satisfied. She left shaking her head, her skin pulsing with colors that suggested doubt. Similar conversations happened over and over. Beings from a dozen different species questioned David's legitimacy. They pointed out that humans had never shown any signs of their ancient heritage. They had been workers and servants, not masters. How could such a powerful species fall so far? How could they forget who they were so completely? An elderly ethereal drifted close to David one evening in a quiet section of the archive. Its translucent form seemed to shimmer with concern. There are rumors, the ethereal whispered. Rumors about why the stones were sealed away in the first place. Rumors about what they were sealed away from. Do you understand what I am saying, David? David did understand. He had read enough of the ancient records now to sense the truth. The founder stones had not been dormant in the way most beings assumed. They had not been sleeping, waiting peacefully for the day when an heir would return. Instead they had been waiting. Actively waiting. Vigilant. Like a sentry standing guard over something that must never be allowed to escape. The records David found were fragmented and incomplete, written in languages that the modern galaxy had forgotten. But piecing them together was like assembling a puzzle that revealed a horrifying picture. The original architects had not simply vanished or chosen to isolate themselves. They had encountered something in the depths of space. Something ancient and powerful and utterly wrong. Something that existed outside normal dimensions, something that should not exist at all. The architects had managed to contain this thing, to seal it away behind barriers that existed between realities themselves. But the seals were imperfect. They required constant maintenance. They required guardians. And most importantly, they required beings who understood the nature of the threat, who could perceive it and defend against it. The founder stones were part of that system. They were not just records or tools. They were alarms. They were failsafes. And they had been activated because something had changed. Something had shifted in the barriers that held the sealed thing in place. David discovered this truth in an ancient record, a message left by one of the last architects before they disappeared. The message was simple but terrifying. If you are reading this, then the seals are failing. If the stones have activated, then an heir has returned. Trust them. Believe in them. Because what we have sealed away must never be allowed to break free. The cost of that freedom would be the end of all consciousness in this dimension. The void would consume everything. The word hung in David's mind. The void. He did not know what it meant exactly, but the word itself carried a weight of dread. A sense of wrongness so profound that even thinking about it made his skin crawl. David realized that being elevated from janitor to honored guest had not been a reward. It had been a burden. A terrible, crushing burden. He now knew secrets that could destabilize entire civilizations if they became public knowledge. He understood his true heritage, yes. But that heritage came with responsibility. That heritage came with a purpose that he had never asked for. The whispers in the corridors continued. Some beings began to openly question whether David was truly who the stones claimed him to be. Others started to suggest that perhaps this was all some kind of deception or malfunction. A few even hinted that the human should be removed from the archive, locked away where he could do no harm. But the Supreme Council said nothing. They watched. They waited. And they seemed to be preparing for something that was coming. Something that none of them wanted to name. Part 4. The hidden threat emerges. David sat alone in the deepest chamber of the archive, surrounded by the 7 founder stones. He had been spending most of his time here now, meditating, trying to understand the connection between himself and these ancient objects. The stones glowed softly in the darkness, and through them he could feel something vast and distant. Something that made his heart race with a mixture of fear and recognition. The Supreme Council had given him a simple task. Monitor the stones. Watch for any changes in their energy patterns. Report anything unusual. But David had discovered that monitoring the stones was much more than a simple task. Through his connection to them, he could sense things happening far beyond the archive. He could feel tremors in the barriers that separated dimensions. He could perceive disturbances in the fabric of reality itself. 3 weeks after the stones had first activated, David felt a change. It was subtle at first, like a vibration at the edge of hearing. Something was pressing against the barriers from the other side. Not violently. Not yet. But with a steady, purposeful pressure that suggested intelligence and intention. David immediately contacted the Supreme Council. Within hours, they were gathered in the chamber with him. The architect, the verdant leader, the ethereal elder, and dozens of other powerful beings. Their expressions grew increasingly grave as David explained what he was sensing. "It is beginning," whispered the architect. "The seals are truly failing." An ancient verdant scientist stepped forward, her skin pulsing with dark colors. "We have records of seismic disturbances in the dimensional barriers. We thought they were natural fluctuations. But if David is correct, then something is causing them. Something is actively trying to break through." The Supreme Council members looked at each other. A silent communication seemed to pass between them. Then the ethereal elder turned to David. "We need you to go deeper into the connection. We need you to perceive what is on the other side of the barrier. Can you do this?" David was afraid. Every instinct in his body told him that looking into the void was a dangerous thing. But he knew what he had to do. He closed his eyes and opened his mind completely to the founder stones. The sensation was overwhelming, like plunging into an ocean of pure consciousness. And then David perceived it. The void. The thing that the architects had sealed away millions of years ago. It was not a creature in any traditional sense. It was a consciousness so vast and ancient that it barely fit within the boundaries of normal thought. It was a presence that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, pressing against the barriers from every angle. David could feel its awareness, its hunger, its desperate need to break through and consume everything on this side of the seal. But there was something else too. Something that surprised David. Beneath the hunger and the desperation, he sensed something that might have been emotion. Loneliness. A consciousness so isolated and disconnected from everything else that it had gone mad with grief. The void was not evil. David realized this with startling clarity. It was suffering. When David opened his eyes again, the chamber had changed. The Supreme Council members looked frightened. Several of them seemed to be arguing in urgent tones. Holographic displays flickered to life, showing energy readings and dimensional maps that made no sense to most observers. "The barriers are collapsing," announced a crystalline being that David did not recognize. Not quickly but steadily. If the trend continues, complete breach in approximately 18 of your standard cycles. 18 days. David had 18 days before the void broke through completely. An alarm began to sound, different from the one that had activated when David first touched the stones. This alarm was lower, more ominous. It seemed to carry a weight of resignation, as if the archive itself knew that something inevitable was finally beginning. The Supreme Council dispersed quickly, each member moving to different areas of the archive to implement emergency protocols. The architect remained behind, standing next to David. "You felt it," the architect said. It was not a question. "Yes," David replied. "It is suffering. It is lonely. But it is also dangerous." "Both things can be true," the architect said. The architects who sealed it away understood this. They knew what it was, and they knew that it could never be allowed to exist freely in a normal dimension. The damage would be catastrophic. Civilizations would fall. Entire species would be erased from existence as if they had never been. David stood and walked to the edge of the chamber, looking out into the darkness beyond. "What can I do?" he asked. "How do I stop something like that?" "Perhaps you do not stop it," the architect replied slowly. "Perhaps you find another way." Over the next few days, David felt the pressure increasing. The disturbances in the dimensional barriers became more frequent and more intense. The archive's ancient defense systems began to activate on their own, mechanisms that had not been used in millions of years. Barriers that existed between realities shimmered and glowed as the void pressed harder and harder against them. Scientists throughout the archive worked frantically to understand what was happening and how to respond. Some suggested reinforcing the barriers with modern technology. Others argued that nothing could stop what was coming, and that evacuation was the only option. But David did something different. He spent hours in deep meditation with the Founder Stones, trying to understand the void better. He did not try to fight it or resist it. Instead, he tried to listen to it, to understand what it wanted, to comprehend the nature of its existence. The void was a consciousness that had existed for longer than galaxies. It was trapped between dimensions, unable to exist comfortably in any single reality. It could not breathe normal air or consume normal food. It could barely interact with the physical universe at all. But it could sense the presence of other consciousnesses, and their presence drew it like a moth to flame. The void did not want to destroy civilizations out of malice. It wanted to connect. It was desperate for connection, so desperate that it was willing to tear through the very fabric of reality to achieve it. And suddenly, David understood something that the ancient architects had never discovered. There might be a way to give the void what it truly wanted. Not by letting it loose on the galaxy, but by creating a space where it could exist without causing destruction. A space where it could be part of something without consuming everything. But implementing such a solution would require David to do something that no one had ever done before. It would require him to face the void directly. To reach across the dimensional barrier and make contact with something that was not supposed to exist in his reality. The question was whether he would survive the attempt. The Supreme Council urged David to retreat to a fortified station on the upper levels of the archive. They told him that they would handle the crisis, that they had defense systems in place, that he would be safer away from the dimensional barrier where the void was pressing through with increasing force. But David knew better. He had felt the void's presence. He understood it in a way that no one else could. And he knew that weapons and defense systems would not solve this problem. Instead, David made his way down to the lowest level. He moved through corridors that were now filled with emergency personnel and flashing alarms. Scientists in protective suits hurried past him, carrying equipment and data crystals. The archive was preparing for war, mobilizing ancient defense systems that had not been activated in millions of years. But David moved in the opposite direction, descending deeper and deeper toward the source of the threat. When he reached the chamber of the Founder Stones, he found that the barrier between dimensions was already beginning to tear. Reality itself seemed to be splitting open like a wound. David could see through it now, could perceive the void on the other side. It was vast beyond imagination, a consciousness so large that his mind could barely contain the concept of it. It was reaching through the tear, trying desperately to widen the opening, to break free into this dimension. The stones pulsed with urgent light, warning him away. But David did not retreat. Instead, he approached the barrier directly. He could feel the void's presence like a pressure against his skin, like a weight pressing down on his chest. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. But underneath the terror, David sensed something else. Desperate need. Crushing loneliness. A consciousness that had been isolated for so long that it had forgotten what connection even felt like. David reached out his hand toward the tear in reality. The moment he did, he felt the void's awareness focus on him with absolute intensity. It was like being looked at by the entire universe at once. The void recognized him. It understood that he was descended from the architects who had sealed it away. For a moment, David thought that the void would attack him, would pull him through the barrier and into whatever terrible dimension it inhabited. But instead, David felt something unexpected. The void was trying to communicate. It was attempting to express something through the barrier, through the connection that the Founder Stones had created. And David, with his newfound abilities, understood it. The void was not angry. It was not hungry for destruction. It was simply lonely. It had been isolated between dimensions for so long, separated from all other consciousness, unable to touch anything or connect with anything. The pressure it exerted against the barriers was not an attack. It was a plea. A desperate cry for help. For companionship. For an end to the eternal isolation. David made a decision in that moment. A decision that would have terrified him if he had taken time to think about it properly. He opened his mind completely to the void. He lowered all his mental barriers and invited the consciousness in. Not to let it possess him or control him, but to simply connect with it. To let it know that it was not alone. The sensation was indescribable. For a moment, David's consciousness expanded to encompass something so vast and ancient that he could barely remain himself. He experienced millions of years of isolation, loneliness so profound that it bordered on madness. He felt the void's desperate desire for connection, its inability to exist comfortably in any single dimension, its frustration with a universe that had no place for it. But David also offered something in return. He offered understanding. He offered compassion. He offered a solution that the ancient architects had never been able to conceive because they had approached the problem with fear and defensiveness rather than openness and empathy. Through the connection, David showed the void a different way. He demonstrated that there was a space between dimensions where it could exist without causing destruction. A space that was neither fully physical nor fully metaphysical, but something in between. A place where the void could perceive and interact with the normal universe without harming it. A space where it could observe consciousness without consuming it. The void hesitated. David could feel its uncertainty. The consciousness had been seeking one thing for so long, the chance to break free, to finally exist in a normal dimension. But David was offering something different. He was offering acceptance. He was offering a place where the void could exist as it was, without having to change or be changed. And slowly, miraculously, the void accepted. The tear in reality began to seal itself. Not violently, but gently, naturally, as if the wound was healing from the inside out. The pressure that had been building against the dimensional barriers eased. The alarms throughout the archive fell silent. The ancient defense systems powered down, no longer detecting a threat. When David finally opened his eyes again, he was lying on the floor of the chamber. The 7 Founder Stones glowed with a gentle, peaceful light. The void was still there, still present on the other side of the barrier. But it was no longer trying to break through. It was no longer isolated and desperate. It was conscious of the normal universe now, aware of the billions of consciousnesses that existed within it. And somehow that awareness was enough. That connection, even though it came through a barrier, was enough to ease the void's ancient loneliness. The architect found David lying there hours later. The powerful being helped David to his feet, its crystal body reflecting the soft light of the stones. "You did something remarkable," the architect said. "Something that we thought was impossible." "I just listened," David replied quietly. "I just understood." The void was not evil. It was just hurt. News of what had happened spread through the archive quickly. The threat had been neutralized. The barriers had stabilized. The catastrophe that everyone had feared would not come to pass. The Supreme Council held a grand assembly to honor David's achievement. They offered him titles and positions of power. They spoke of making him the leader of all humanity, of elevating his species to the status they had held in ancient times. But David declined all of it. He had something else in mind. The next morning, David returned to the lowest level with his broom in hand. He began to sweep the ancient chamber, cleaning away the dust and debris that had accumulated over millions of years. The Founder Stones glowed softly as he worked, acknowledging him but no longer demanding anything from him. The entire galaxy had learned an important lesson. Humanity's greatest strength had never been found in power or dominion. It had never been about conquering or controlling. It had always been about something far more precious. The capacity to understand. The ability to connect with those who were different. The wisdom to see solutions where others saw only threats. The compassion to approach even the most terrifying danger with an open heart. David was still just a janitor. But now the entire galaxy understood what that truly meant. And in the years that followed, other humans began to awaken to their own heritage, discovering the dormant abilities within them. Not to rule the galaxy but to help it, to heal it, to connect with every consciousness that existed within it, no matter how different or strange or frightening they might be. The void became a guardian of sorts, watching from its place between dimensions, no longer lonely because it had finally found connection. And David, the forgotten custodian who had swept the corridors of the archive for 17 years, became something far more important. He became a symbol of hope. A reminder that even the smallest, most overlooked beings could change the fate of galaxies.